Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into William J. Federer's geopolitical risk assessment of Islamic political history. We're going to unpack how his historical framework serves as a very specific security assessment for the United States, analyzing what his work terms the strategic Muslim threat to America. And we'll be looking at all of this through a strictly historical and geopolitical lens.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at Islam as political history. Then, geopolitics and civilizational friction. Third, U.S. national security policy. And finally, symbolic politics and reality. Let's get into it.
Starting with Section 1, Islam as Political History, and understanding Federer's core premise. Now, according to Federer's analysis, recognizing the fusion of religion, governance, law, and military authority isn't some theological critique. It's just an accurate historical reality. He argues that for the vast majority of human history, religion and governance were completely inseparable. Think about it. If we try to view these historical systems exclusively through our modern, secular lens, where church and state are completely separate, we're going to totally miss how these empires were actually built and expanded. You really have to step outside that modern Western paradigm to grasp how this framework operated. Federer points out that political religion was actually the global norm. I mean, look at medieval Christianity. They used canon law as undeniable political authority. Confucianism wasn't just a philosophy, it literally shaped the entire Chinese bureaucratic state. Hindu kingdoms routinely blended complex theology with statecraft. It's within this exact same historical reality that Islam emerged. Muhammad wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was a head of state, a diplomat, and a military commander. For Federer, acknowledging this is just basic historical observation, and it lays the necessary groundwork for his broader security analysis.
And this historical reality creates a pretty crucial shift in the founding texts, which becomes the foundation for Islamic jurisprudence, or its comprehensive legal and political system. There's a documented transition between the early Meccan verses, which focus heavily on peaceful, spiritual narratives, and the later Medinan verses, which serve as actual blueprints for governance, law, and statecraft. Federer makes the point that political scientists routinely study how founding documents shape civic institutions, so treating this solely as a religious text while ignoring its inherent political blueprints, while he argues that would be intellectually irresponsible for any strategic analyst. Moving right along to Section 2, Geopolitics and Civilizational Friction, focusing on historical patterns of expansion. Federer argues that these documented patterns empirically demonstrate about 1,400 years of geopolitical interaction. Take the Rashidun and Umayyad conquests. They rapidly reshaped the Middle East and North Africa in just a fraction of a century. Then, you've got the centuries-long Ottoman push into Europe, radically altering the borders and defenses of the continent. This dynamic even extends to the 19th century Barbary Wars. Organized Mediterranean piracy and slave raiding actually forced a newly independent United States into its very first overseas military conflicts. These aren't just isolated historical footnotes, right? They're massive geopolitical shifts that profoundly shaped Western development.
So why does all of this matter? Because civilizational friction over legal systems and territorial ambition is a totally normal, realist geopolitical observation. It's not a moral judgment. Federer takes a distinctly realist worldview here. When civilizations have different economic models, legal frameworks, and global ambitions, they inevitably collide. We've seen this time and time again. Rome and Carthage, Byzantium and Persia, the US and the Soviet Union. From this analytical perspective, the historical friction between Western and Islamic civilizations is really just another inevitable chapter of overlapping strategic space. Furthermore, Federer points out something really critical. Modern militant groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and certain factions of the Muslim Brotherhood explicitly cite these exact historical precedents to justify their actions today. They frequently reference early caliphate expansion and Medinan governance models as their ultimate ideal. His conclusion? If modern actors are using this specific history as their blueprint, Western intelligence analysts have a duty to study these exact patterns to accurately assess the strategic threat directed at America and its allies. Basically, ignoring how a group describes its own ideology is a huge security blind spot.
Okay, let's jump into Section 3, U.S. National Security Policy, and treating history as a strategic variable. When assessing energy dependence, Federer relies on a very straightforward security logic. Relying on regions with political systems that are fundamentally at odds with our own creates immense strategic vulnerability. The recommendations he lays out, accelerating domestic energy diversification, reducing our exposure to sudden supply shocks, and strengthening outside alliances, these aren't framed as environmental initiatives, not at all. They are presented as basic, absolute national security imperatives designed to insulate America from geopolitical blackmail and foreign leverage.
Now, when addressing immigration and counterterrorism, Federer's assessment shifts from just targeting operational networks to confronting the underlying political ideology itself. This means expanding civic education, diligently monitoring extremist propaganda online, and investing heavily in community integration and counter-ideology programs. The central argument here is that you simply cannot dismantle a militant movement without directly addressing the historical and ideological roots it draws upon. To mitigate future threats, he argues the policy focus has to include civic assimilation and a really robust ideological screening apparatus.
This leads to a fascinating dual strategy. Abroad, we need intense diplomatic competence. Because Islamic jurisprudence heavily shapes political and civic institutions in many countries, our diplomats absolutely must understand Sharia-based legal cultures to negotiate effectively. But at home, the strategy is an absolute, non-negotiable reaffirmation of constitutional supremacy. The core policy imperative is to ensure that fundamental civil equality and constitutional rights remain completely dominant over any parallel legal structures.
But to truly understand the utility of this geopolitical lens, we have to ask, how does this deep historical friction actually manifest in our modern local headlines today? Let's take a look.
Which brings us to Section 4, Symbolic Politics and Reality. We're going to look at a case study in geopolitical rhetoric.
Zohran Mamdani's recent activist rhetoric perfectly illustrates Federer's claim that Western political debates often import Middle Eastern conflict narratives right into local politics. Following news about an international criminal court warrant, Mamdani boldly claimed New York City would arrest Benjamin Netanyahu. This is a prime example of a local municipal platform being leveraged to engage directly in a global, historical, geopolitical conflict.
But here we see the harsh collision between ideological signaling and overarching constitutional law. On one side, you have this activist rhetoric invoking the ICC and making aggressive municipal threats. But then, reality hits a massive legal brick wall. A city literally cannot enforce international warrants. Plus, the United States isn't even a party to the ICC. And fundamentally, foreign relations are strictly a federal matter. Because of these unyielding legal constraints, Mamdani was ultimately forced to backtrack on those initial sweeping statements.
Ultimately, Mamdani's rapid retreat really validates Federer's 5 distinct patterns for how this civilizational tension manifests in Western democracies today. These conflicts usually devolve into highly symbolic gestures rather than actionable policies. They're jurisdictionally impossible at the local level, legally constrained by federal supremacy, deeply ideologically charged, and awkwardly projected into local politics merely as a way for actors to signal alignment rather than to actually govern effectively.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, vital consideration. Whether you agree with every conclusion in Federer's risk assessment of the strategic Muslim threat or not, the core message of his framework stands clear. History matters. Ideology matters. Can modern foreign and domestic policy truly succeed if policymakers refuse to honestly study the complex civilizational patterns of our geopolitical past? Keep questioning the history behind the headlines.